Welcome to History 108. In this lecture, we will address the labor struggles of the 1940s, though we will touch on a few other decades, but for the most part, we'll focus after the war and how the American labor movement begins to change, particularly by focusing not only on labor rights, things such as better wages and better working conditions, but also touching on civil rights. Now, the intention wasn't to focus on civil rights, but these issues kind of went hand in hand because, as you're well aware, America has many different people of different ethnicities, and some people were being treated better than others. So unions came together and tried to fight for all workers' rights, regardless of gender or race or background. So this lecture will look at those type of issues, which will essentially give rise to the civil rights movement of the 1960s. The objectives for this class are three. Number one, we will see how World War II and how the New Deal, particularly New Deal legislation, impacted the labor movement. Now, that's not to say that government supported some of these labor movements that were taking place, but what did happen, particularly in the 1930s, is that government essentially legitimized unions and allowed them to organize and have a political voice when it came to fighting for better working conditions. Number two, we will see how all workers came together demanding better, like I said, better working conditions, better pay. There's a slew of topics that they covered, but what's really kind of key here is that the 1930s and 40s, we really see how many people begin to work together and try to fight corporate greed and try to improve the the working conditions of the working class. Here you see pictures of mostly women here, but you also see men, and the interests of women are also the interests of men, and we'll touch on those subjects here. And then lastly, as addressed a second ago, we will see how labor struggles coincided with civil rights struggles. So there's a lot of origins to the civil rights movement of the 1960s. However, many scholars have noted that labor movement played a very important role in shaping the civil rights movement of the 1960s. So I want you to understand that something like the Black Power movement or Chicano Power or even the student movement of the 1960s did not come out of a vacuum, but rather had a rich history in the labor movement. All right, so let's look at different aspects of the labor movements of the 1940s, and again, we'll make that connection with civil rights. So let's look at the 1940s. The war was now over, and the US was shifting from a war economy to a consumer-driven economy. It is 1945, and much of the economic recovery from the Great Depression was due to World War II, with millions entering military-industrial jobs while others left for the war. However, with the war over, that meant that there would be a slew of returning GIs competing with other workers, as we saw that by 1943, unemployment had essentially vanished, but fears of an influx of workers could have driven the US back into a recession or an economic depression. Such economic opportunities did trickle down beyond the labor shop, but also into the idea that economic power was tied to civil rights, as many American ethnic minorities, which included everyone from hyphenated Americans, so you're Italian, you're Jewish, you're Polish, you're Russian, you're Hungarian, you're Greek, to women who saw their job give them a political voice through organized labor. In this lecture, we will see how labor became an epicenter to fight for civil rights and give the working class a voice. Legislation from the New Deal had transformed how the working class saw themselves, and organized labor used these new tools to fight for better wages and better working conditions. However, that did not mean that industrialists just sat back and accepted their defeat. On the contrary, their relationship with government due to the war allowed them to strip the power of unions as time went forward, particularly into the 1950s. So let's examine the status of the US economy right after the war and see what workers were up against. Since so much money was pumped into the US economy due to the war production, it now meant that those war bills would need to be paid. Between 1942 and 1943, the US government instituted the Revenue Acts in order to institute our modern federal income tax system. Prior to this, most Americans had never paid income taxes because it was mostly focused on upper income families and corporations. Anyone making more than $600 per year had to now file an income tax return, and by 1945, the US collected about $45 billion in revenue, which it did not even cover half the cost of the war. With the war over and a peacetime economy trying to reestablish itself, there were a few hiccups along the way. U.S. economic centers took a shift as industrial production moved from northeast to the south and to the west, growing at a rate of 50% in the west, while the northeast only grew at about 10%. So you have new economic centers, no longer in that northeastern part of the world, of the United States, but now really moving to places like Arizona and California. The US economy also surpassed that of Europe since it was now in shambles thanks to the war. Prior to the war, the US economy equaled that of Europe and Russia combined, but by the late 1950s, with only 6% of the world population, the United States produced about 40% of the world's goods and services. In addition, the US government followed a Keynesian economic model that continued to pump money into the US economy. So the government is essentially, spending. So things like the GI Bill contributed $14.5 billion into different sectors, particularly education, as universities expanded to accommodate an incoming class of GIs seeking higher education. In addition, it allowed many GIs to purchase homes and farms, which we will later see in a semester, contributed to the explosion of suburban life. Lastly, just because the war was over didn't mean that the war spending ended. As we will later see, the Cold War was instrumental in helping build the idea of the American dream. A partnership between business, the Pentagon, Congress, and universities helped build what would later be known as the military-industrial complex, where it morphed into a modern, somewhat permanent economic system that fueled upward mobility for many. The war did create opportunities for many people from different walks of life. For one, we see hyphenated Americans who had migrated from Eastern and Southern Europe in the early 20th century. So these would be your Italians, your Russians, a lot of Eastern Europeans. So a lot of them ended up joining the Democratic Party during the New Deal and the Great Depression, and during the Great Depression, hoping to, quote, promote a notion of government that protected the well-being of ordinary citizens. That's because partly the Republican Party caused the Great Depression, so many workers sided with the Democratic Party in the 1930s. So historian Elizabeth Cohen's study of Chicago in the 1920s and 30s provides a great study of how European migrants shed their immigrant European identities, so many of them begin to leave their ethnic enclaves, your little Italys and little Odessas and things like that. These are places within like cities like New York, right? So they begin to leave these places and begin to join the workforce in industrial Chicago, partly because the Great Depression shattered their ethnic institutions, while industrialists did everything in their power to quell labor union drives. In fact, many of these quote-unquote ethnic whites had already become somewhat Americanized through mass culture, such as consuming American products, going to the movies, or attending the great American pastime, watching baseball, which led them to join other ethnic communities to better their working conditions. In addition, the failure of what's called welfare capitalism, so this idea of welfare capitalism, promised things like profit sharing, financial aid towards a home, old age pensions, and even death insurance. that sometimes employers provided. So many workers felt that management did not care about the working class. So many of these quote unquote white Europeans looked to the federal government to better improve the living conditions of the working class. To some extent, this is how European migrants became quote unquote white. So by joining unions such as the CIO. In addition, federal legislation passed during the Great Depression, such as the Wagner Act, gave workers the right to unionize, which was a major step in improving the lives of the American working class. During the war, many of these communities, along with the working class, benefited from the wartime economy, and the relationship between union and government had only grown during this time. Though there were many struggles between union leaders, the rank and file, and government officials, for the most part, we find that workers gain a seat at the table to negotiate wages, hours, and collective bargaining, particularly with the War Labor Board. In order to help the war effort, unions promised not to strike, and they cooperated with industry to not disrupt the production line. Again, because it was the war, right? Everybody was fighting the common enemy. This, in turn, helped workers not only get better pay, but also seek better opportunities. This material gain allowed the working class to see an improvement in the quality of life, not only for themselves at the workplace, but also at their home, which this is why union participation increased to its highest level of 33% during this period. In fact, union workers now demanded a seat at the table, such as in GM, General Motors, where they demanded a 30% pay raise in hourly wages, particularly due to the inflation during the war. So after the war, they demanded a pay increase. They also demanded access to the company's books and more say in company decisions. They did not get everything they wanted, but in 1950, the Treaty of Detroit was agreed upon, where workers would obtain a cost of living, an annual wage increase tied to worker productivity, and an increase in their pension plan. However, the union's goal of restructuring industrial relations or remaking society was abandoned in order to focus more on quote unquote bread and butter issues such as wages and hours, working conditions, fringe benefits, and job security. It was a major turn for labor as the battles from the 1920s to the 1930s now seemed to settle down, particularly because, thanks to FDR and the New Deal, workers had a stronger voice. Let's not forget, though, that industrialists did everything in their power to limit it during this period, which is why we had 2 million machinists, longshoremen, and other workers around the U.S. call a record 4,985 strikes in 1946. But such progress from the previous decade did give hope to other workers, particularly those from marginalized communities. So let's look at how labor unionism and civil rights were connected. So most of you are familiar with the major civil rights movement of the 1960s and 70s. However, most do not recognize that many of the roots of these movements are tied to the labor movements of the 1940s and 50s, which historians have labeled civil rights unionism. As World War II came to an end, the idea of the American dream was becoming a reality for a selected few, but for African Americans, it was still a long way off, particularly because of Jim Crow laws and blatant racism in American culture. So Jim Crow laws are basically legal ways to discriminate against people of color, particularly African Americans. Many Americans joined the Communist Party and labor unions in the 1930s during the Great Depression, which by this time moved away from any Bolshevik-style revolution and rather embraced New Deal liberalism, emphasizing progressive reforms that included coalition building with industrial unions, liberals, students, and cultural organizations. These movements welcomed people from all walks of life, such as women, African Americans, hyphenated whites, migrants, the working class, and any other person that was being exploited. They promoted things like women obtaining birth control and abortions, advocated for equality at the workplace, and fought for the end of racism. In other words, it was a civil rights movement that functioned through unions. For African Americans, many of their struggles to obtain civil rights were fought at the workplace. With World War II right around the corner, Roosevelt gave his famous Arsenal of Democracy speech that advocated cooperation of heavy industry and the working class to come together for their patriotic duty to defeat the enemy and have the workers adopt a non-strike agreement. For African Americans, this was a call for action. For many years, African Americans, quote, found themselves unwelcomed by employers and white workers, both of whom argued that blacks were insufficiently skilled while at the same time denying them opportunities for apprenticeship and other war production training programs, as many employers admitted to following rigid anti-black policies, unquote. African American civil rights organizations met with the Roosevelt administration, and what emerged was the Office of Production Management, where it established, quote, a black employment and training branch in its labor division to facilitate the hiring of African Americans in defense industries. However, these official statements were not accompanied by any enforcement and thus had produced little results, unquote. What it did show was that civil rights were connected to labor rights, and African Americans fought for opportunities, particularly in the new war economy. In fact, thanks to New Deal programs such as the National Youth Administration and the Work Projects Administration, the WPA, thousands of African Americans had attained the necessary skills for employment in the defense industry. By 1942, more than 58,000 African Americans had enrolled in pre-employment courses. In the summer of 43, quote, 65 black colleges participated in the ESMWT program, which trained more than 50,000 students for work in aircraft industries, shipbuilding, welding, automotive mechanics, electricity and radio, and numerous other defense-related activities, unquote. It was with the Executive Order 8802 where we saw how the link between government, labor, and civil rights came together as the government passed the Executive Order in order to end discrimination, not because they wanted to, but rather because African Americans fought for it and demanded it. It was the first time the federal government took action to promote equal opportunity in employment and created the Fair Employment Practice Committee to monitor compliance, so that people actually follow the law, right? Companies actually follow the law not to discriminate. This shift at least gave the illusion that government cared about equality. Recall that this is still during the era of Jim Crow, so African Americans saw that the government could do something to end discrimination, even if it was just in the defense industry. Many African Americans joined labor unions such as the United Automobile Workers, the UAW, the United Steelworkers, the National Maritime Union, the Rubber Workers. And African Americans were on the National Council of the CIO, one of the most important unions, the Congress of Industrial Workers. This was the starting point, and their living conditions did improve slightly, but as a whole, African Americans still face many obstacles as they, quote, remain disproportionately concentrated in unskilled labor, personal service, and domestic work, with family income, housing, school, and Medicare care inferior to that of whites, unquote. After the war, the struggle continued as even the, quote, NAACP and the National Urban League emphasized the need for greater class consciousness and not simply race consciousness, along with white-black unity within the working class, unquote. With black migration increasing in the 1940s from southern states into the north in cities such as Detroit and into the west to places such as San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Oakland, African Americans became an important group of workers that joined unions and demanded, quote, racial equality in the workplace and housing and in other aspects of life, unquote, within their new home cities. Unions such as the CIO adhered to this call as CIO leader John L. Lewis took a position in 1938 of, quote, uncompromising to any form of discrimination, whether political or economic, based on race, color, creed, or nationality, unquote. In the 1940s, CIO labor leftists and labor liberals cooperated, working with whites, blacks, etc., and allied with civil rights organizations in United Front campaigns where they proposed 55 anti-discrimination bills in employment in states with large industrial population in 1945. They also worked with the Southern Negro Youth Congress and the National Negro Congress and branches of the NAACP, endorsing their agendas to fight for a permanent Federal Employment Practice Commission at the state and national level, the passage of anti-lynching legislation, and abolition to the poll tax. In southern states such as Tennessee and North Carolina, CIO activism in support of black voting rights during the 1940s offered an early model for voting rights campaigns in later decades in the 1960s. African American women were not immune to these actions, as 8,000 of them joined the United Cannery Agricultural Packing and Allied Workers of America, UCAPAWA as it was known, and took leadership roles within the unions, such as Miranda Smith, or quote, Miranda Smith, who sat at the bargaining table with the white employers, unquote. In Winston-Salem, North Carolina, black labor was empowered to fight for the rights of the returning GIs for their right to vote. Local 22 mobilized a, quote, black voter registration drive through the CIO Political Action Committee with the demand that black veterans be given the right to vote, unquote. By focusing on citizenship, African Americans made a direct link between black voting rights and economic and racial advancement. In New York, the United Electrical Workers, United Public Workers, National Maritime Union, and Hotel and Restaurant Workers of America addressed issues of housing discrimination, police brutality, and racial disparities in hiring. Thus, as you can see, unions were important to the civil rights movement, and we see a direct link between the 1940s and what will come next in the 1960s. Like African Americans, Mexican Americans saw unions as the avenue towards full integration and citizenship. The largest concentration of Mexican Americans was in the Southwest, in particularly Los Angeles, where there was a large defense industry, so naturally they sought many of these job opportunities, even though many still worked out in the agricultural fields. Like African Americans, Mexican Americans faced discrimination in different sectors of society, and when they entered the defense industry, they tended to have the lowest jobs. And with African Americans moving out west, both groups were fighting for the same crumbs. As noted earlier, Executive Order 8802 opened doors, but employers used many of the same excuses that were used against African Americans in order not to hire Mexican Americans, such as that, quote, skilled Mexicans weren't available, or that Mexicans were unable to perform skilled tasks, unquote. Though the excuses worked for a while, the need for labor was key in winning the war, so the CIO, quote, worked to open job training programs and jobs for minorities in war industries, that by 1943, 58,000 Mexican Americans were at work in war industries, unquote. After the war, Mexican Americans continued the battle at the workplace for better wages. In fact, it was a Mexican American, Senator Dennis Chavez of New Mexico, that sought to permanently establish the FEPC that guaranteed, quote, equality and economic opportunity, unquote. Though it failed due to anti-black and anti-labor Southern Dixiecrats who upheld, quote unquote, states' rights and opposed any kind of federal intervention in addressing racial equality. Regardless, Mexican Americans also tied economic opportunity to racial equality and saw that the federal government was key in ending legal segregation against people of color. Though there are many examples of Mexican Americans striking and fighting for workers' rights, one example that exemplifies this battle is the Salt of the Earth strike. In this specific example, Mexican American leaders and members of the Mine Mill Union launched their strike for higher wages and better working conditions in the mines of New Mexico. During the Korean War, anti-labor and anti-communist groups condemned their actions, and even the CIO, the union, expelled the union from their organizations. Thus, they were on their own. With FBI informants and infiltrators within the union, the goal was to demolish not only the upcoming strike, but the labor union itself. However, in September of 1950, at the Empire Zinc Company near Hanover, New Mexico, workers went on strike and faced harassment, arrests, and police surveillance lasting for 15 months. Many were arrested, and this could have derailed the strike. However, the women, the wives of these workers, took to the picket line and supported the cause. So many of these men could have been fired just by striking, since again they were no longer recognized by the union. So it was the women who stepped in, their wives who stepped in to continue the strike. In addition, they addressed their grievances and added them to the demands, such as listing basic needs such as housing, or better housing, hot water, and indoor plumbing, just to name a few. Though harassed and assaulted by the local police, the women stood strong and became important members by giving speeches, raising money, and helping boost morale. In fact, it was the women who sometimes were more militant than the men when it came to labor rights. In the cannery industry, Mexican American women organized and joined the food, tobacco, agricultural, and allied workers, which was one of the most egalitarian of labor unions and was sensitive to women's needs. And then, quote, in California during the war, they had been successful in negotiating nurseries for the workers' children, unquote. This was a clear example of how labor rights were more than just about pay, because many of these women didn't have the resources to afford childcare. So having the workplace provided was instrumental for their economic survival and advancement. Being one of the most progressive unions, they often became targets of the anti-communist movements of the late 40s and 50s, particularly by the U.S. government. The INS deported some of their best organizers, such as Luisa Moreno, who was of Guatemalan nationality, because they claimed that she was a communist. And here you have some examples. This is the Salt of the Earth strike here, where the women are marching, blocking, these industrialists to go in, or maybe bringing in some scab workers, I think. And then over here you have women in the cannery industry, again, joining unions, kind of break the myth that that's women want to be in the home, or women are in the home and men are out working. Quite the opposite. Women are working. So let's examine women and labor unions in the 1940s and 50s. So, women's experience followed those of the working class, particularly during World War II, as 5 million women entered the labor force between 1940 and 1945, with an estimated 37% of all women working outside the home. Like other groups, women were trained in skilled jobs such as welders, riveters, and electricians, challenging the idea that women only did pink-collar jobs, such as secretaries or service jobs. Again, the role of government was instrumental of connecting labor with civil rights, because in November of 1942, the National War Labor Board passed, quote, General Order Number 16, calling for equal wages for women when they worked, when they were doing the same comparable jobs to men. And like others, union membership skyrocketed from 9.4% before the war to 22% by 1944. During the reconversion period, this is when we're transitioning, back to a consumer economy after the war, right? No longer a military economy. Women hope to continue to work, which is something that challenges the myth that women wanted to go back to the home sphere. This is something that we're often taught in American history. In fact, many women were shocked that they were dismissed from their jobs, as 60% in heavy industries were fired rather than them choosing to leave. And this is what you see in this picture right here, where they were fired and replacing with the men returning from the war. With the war over, women were forced into the home, much of it due to both GIs returning from war and the Cold War, which promoted the ideal of the nuclear family, neglecting the reality of American families that were led by single mothers as the main breadwinners. Often, societal problems were blamed on working mothers. A best-selling book called Baby and Childcare, published in 1946, argued that, quote, if a mother realizes clearly how vital her care was to her small child, it may make it easier for her to decide that the extra money she might earn, or the satisfaction she might receive from an outside job, is not so important after all, unquote. In other words, women, it was argued, belong in their quote-unquote natural role as mothers rather than as workers. As much as social norms push women into the home, and some did opt to go home, to be at the home with the baby boom surging in the 1940s and 50s, it is noted that in 1940, 25% of women worked, but by 1960, that number increased to 35%, proving that women did not just decide to go back into the home. In fact, one could see that it wasn't single women who entered the job market in that post-war period, but rather married women. In 1940, 17% of married women worked. However, by 1960, that number jumped significantly to 32%. So again, that myth that women went back home is not true, right? With a growing economy, particularly one that focused on consumerism, women entered white-collar jobs in fields such as clerical work, sales, nursing, social work, and teaching, along with service sector jobs, so-called pink-collar jobs, such as food service, personal care, and beauty salons. In fact, waitresses joined unions, with about 25% of them organizing in the 1950s, giving them a voice at the workplace, particularly in an industry that is difficult to unionize due to the fact that it does not require a formal education or any type of trade education. Challenging the feminine mystique of women returning to the home is key because the women's rights movement of the 1960s did not emerge out of a vacuum, and certainly not from a bored housewife that needed something to do. So the feminine mystique argued, hopefully we'll get a chance to read it in this class, but it argued that the women's right movement started because a bunch of bored housewives had nothing to do. They were depressed. They wanted more out of life than just being a housewife and taking care of kids. So they opted to join the feminist movement. Quite the opposite. The writer of the feminine mystique was actually in the late 30s and 40s. She was very politically active in the IPP and kind of progressive causes. In the 50s, she became a housewife, and it's no wonder she was bored because she went from being very active in the 40s to all of a sudden being stuck at home. And again, this is a myth that we're often taught, that women were just bored and needed something to do, so they joined the feminist movement. When in reality, women were working and fighting for workers' rights and also women's rights through unions throughout the 40s and 50s. So rather, women in the post-WW2 period and into the 1950s continued to work and join unions, fighting not only for better pay and working conditions, but also for civil rights, often crossing color lines and supporting each other. Women in the United Packing House Workers of America laid the groundwork for working class women's participation in the feminist movement of the 60s. This union had long roots to the 30s and 40s and followed an egalitarian stance, actively recruiting black men and women. The union members utilized the union's anti-discrimination department, which organized women's conferences, sponsored a women's column in the union's newspaper, and served as a clearinghouse for grievances. Women like Addie Wyatt of Chicago became president of her local chapter and focused on the struggle for racial justice and served as a labor advisor to civil rights leader Martin Luther King. She, along with other prominent black union women, joined forces with, quote, white women to protest racial discrimination in hiring, as well as Packer's policy of racially segregating departments, where white women had cleaner, better paid positions, such as bacon slicers, while black women were regulated to dirty jobs, such as cleaning feces from sausage casings, unquote. In addition, women made connections between work and their domestic lives, particularly the double duty of household chores along with providing income through a job. So again, this is the idea that women has to work and then she has to go home and then work some more, right? The UPWA leader, Marion Simmons, pointed out, quote, with women working in the plants and having to go home to all the household drudgery and assuming the full responsibility of taking care of children during the non-working hours and providing for their keep during working hours, it is impossible for them to exercise their full freedom and equality. We have to map out a plan by which women can be free to exercise their full talents and inclinations, unquote. In other words, they put on full display the extra unpaid labor that many women are expected to do, yet get no recognition and or compensation. As one can clearly see, labor rights did not stop at the workplace, but also continued into the home, thus making the personal political. They continued to fight for better wages, equal pay, and upward mobility at the workplace, along with forcing society to recognize how unpaid household chores are directly linked to the labor market. With the McCarthy era and the anti communist sentiment of the 50s, many of these labor leaders came under attack. Though they did not disappear, many just took the next logical step. Some left the labor struggle and took the skills that they gained and put them to work in the civil rights era. Many became grassroots organizers and became instrumental to the movement of the 1960s. In fact, as we stated in the beginning, the civil rights movement of the 1960s did not start with people like MLK or Cesar Chavez or Malcolm X, etc., but rather had their roots with the labor movements of the 30s and 40s. So let's conclude this. What did we learn? Number one, hopefully see how the New Deal and the World War transformed the way workers saw themselves. It provided different legislation that gave them the opportunity to address some of the grievances that had at the workplace. You have to understand that prior to the 1920s, industrialists could just fire you. You can get hurt at your workplace, and it didn't really matter. You were easily replaceable. Essentially, workers had no rights prior to the 1930s. So, this legislation, things like the Wagner Act and some of the other things that I mentioned in this lecture, gave workers a voice to address any grievance that they might have, whether it be better working conditions, better pay, the 8-hour workday, things like that. Sometimes we assume these things are just given to us by companies, and no, workers had to fight really, really hard for these things. And number two, we see that workers, particularly in the 30s and 40s, workers from different ethnicities came together, right? White people and black people and people of other ethnicities came together and addressed the same struggles because they all faced them together at the workplace. So, brothers and sisters were out in the picket lines fighting for the rights of each other, supporting each other as a community. As I noted during the lecture, right, being white, or at least looking white, didn't necessarily mean that you were going to get better opportunities. As I mentioned, particularly the Italians, the Eastern Europeans, who were not seen as Americans by some people, particularly a union like the AFL, were welcome in the CIO. Why? Because they faced some of the same struggles that these other people of color might have faced. So together they bonded and they worked together. Some of them even intermarried with each other because they work together in unions. So it's a very kind of fascinating period. And they fought for workers' rights, but in doing so, it also became a civil rights movement. And as I noted, that this was kind of not so much start, but definitely continue as part of the civil rights movement by the 1960s. So around the mid to late 1950s, you really see the break where some of these workers might end up leaving some of these unions and start fighting for civil rights. But a lot of that training comes through union tactics, things like sit-ins and so forth, right? Voter registration, as I mentioned earlier, all become instrumental in the civil rights movement, but they learned a lot of this through the unions that they participated in. All right, so I just want to quickly give you a list of some of the sources that I cited in case you're interested, and I hope you enjoyed this lecture.